Jonah chapter 2 is where we'll be tonight. Jonah chapter 2, we'll do a little review of Jonah chapter 1, because you're going to see we're just going to slide right into it from the last verse of chapter 1. But what we talked about last week in the first chapter was that God called Jonah, one of his prophets, called him to go to Nineveh. And Nineveh, if you remember, it's the capital city of Assyria. Okay, the area of Assyria. Assyria being a world empire at that time, one of the world empires, but it was on the rise, and it was one of, if not the most powerful world empires at that time. I know Babylon and Assyria were going at the time and just kind of trying to rule the world. But Assyria was definitely one of the powers that was trying to take over. And it was oppressing and terrorizing Israel. And if you remember, at that time, Israel was divided into two kingdoms, northern and the southern kingdom. Southern kingdom of Judah, northern kingdom of Israel, known as Israel, Samaria. And it was that northern kingdom that Assyria was coming hard against year after year after year for many years, and just oppressing and causing a lot of terrorizing and causing a lot of trouble to the northern kingdom. And the reason that's important is from that northern kingdom is where Jonah came. He came from the northern kingdom, or the area of Assyria. He was near Nazareth. He was a small town near Nazareth is where he was from. And of course, Nazareth is up there in the northern area. And so that's where he was from. So, knowing that, God calls Jonah from that northern area where, the northern area where Assyria is coming hard after those people, just showing such hatred and hostility toward that northern tribe, that northern kingdom. And God comes to one of those people who at that time had to hate them, just had to really have strong bad feelings toward Assyria. God comes to one of those men, one of those people, and says, go to Nineveh and warn them of my judgment. You remember that? So think about that. Put yourself in his shoes. I mean, for years and years and years, Assyria coming against him and his family and his friends and everyone he knows, and just showing so much hatred toward them. And God says, go and warn them. Knowing, and we'll get to this later, but him knowing that God's a forgiving God. He's a compassionate God. He's merciful and gracious. So, what'd Jonah do? He ran away. He said, no, forget it. I'm out of here. No, not for me. He disobeys God, and he runs from God in the opposite direction. And remember, he's going to Tarshish. And Tarshish, it actually at that time was one of the places farthest west that you could go at that time. So he's going in the complete opposite direction of where God told him to go. So he runs away. He boards a ship to get there, going across the sea. Gets caught in a terrible storm, okay? Gets caught in a terrible storm that the Lord brings. It's a storm that the Lord actually brought, okay? Then the men on the ship, there's other men on the ship there, they tried all they could to save themselves and to save Jonah. They're trying everything they can to, row to safety and all that, but it just wasn't happening. They could not move anywhere. So finally, Jonah tells them, throw me in the water. Throw me in the water and the sea will calm down. Because Jonah knew that the reason that strong storm was coming was because of him. He knew God brought the storm. So he says, if you throw me in the sea, it'll calm down. So what they do, they threw him in the water. They tried everything they could to try to not do that. But finally, it came to the point where they threw him in the water, okay? And it tells us that the storm did stop. Immediately, it went calm. at that point. And then the men on the ship, they were so amazed. Do you remember what they did as a result? So amazed. They were so blown away by that. They worshiped God. Now, these were men, by the way, on the ship that when that trouble came, the first thing they tried to do, before they tried rowing with their strength to save themselves, they were calling out to their gods. So that tells us that they were ungodly men at the time. They were worshiping false gods. And by the time that whole experience was over, they were worshiping the God, the existing God, right? That's what Jonah told them, or that's who Jonah told them he worshiped. The existing God, Yahweh. That's what his name means. One of the ways you can interpret that name. The existing one. And that's who they ended up worshiping as a result of all that. And that's a wonderful picture. But that brings us to verse 17 of chapter 1, is what I want to reread as we roll into chapter 2 here. So look at chapter 1, verse 17. And it says, "Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Then it continues on from there and says, "Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly." Now, have to point out a couple things here with this verse. Verse 1 here. Just a couple things we have to look at here. Do you see anything wrong? First of all, do you see anything wrong with the very end of chapter 7, chapter 1, verse 17? The very end of that verse. And the beginning of chapter 2, verse 1. Exactly. Okay, so verse 17 of the last chapter ends with this. Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Okay? And then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. So from what we see in the text, not only in that he, it's not as if he prayed to the Lord and then some time passed, okay? And then the Lord had the fish spit him out, okay? It's not as if he prayed and then time passed and then whoosh, he's thrown out of the fish. But verse 10 indicates in chapter 2 here, if you look at it, so the Lord spoke to the fish and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. That was as soon as he had finished praying, okay? As soon as he had finished his prayer, that's when the Lord told the fish to spit him out. So it was after 3 whole days and 3 nights. After 3 whole days and 3 nights that he finally prays to the Lord. He waits until the end of that time to finally call out to him. So think about this. The storm that the Lord brought was not enough for Jonah to call out to God, was it? The storm that he brought didn't do it. And then the other men of the ship pointing out to him his fault, the foolishness of what he was doing, that wasn't enough. Okay, so we're going to see some stages here. So it wasn't the storm that did it. It wasn't the men, the ungodly men, correcting him, showing him his foolishness. That wasn't enough to get him to call out to God. And then being thrown into the sea, that would do it, right? Okay, now I know I need to call out to God. That didn't do it. That didn't bring him to the point of calling out to God. So then being swallowed by an enormous mammoth of a sea monster here, right? That would do it. No. Still he wouldn't call out to God. That still wasn't enough. So then being inside the fish for 3 days, 3 whole days leading up to that point, that still wasn't enough. Right? I mean, think about all it took for him. How stubborn and how prideful was Jonah. Think about the stubbornness in this man. And it took all those things, situation after situation after situation, and still he would not call out until finally this point, after 3 days, inside the belly of the fish. Just the pride in that man to kick and to fight against the Lord's call, right? To kick and fight against him that much. You know what it is? It's ridiculous, and the guy was just being stupid. Really stupid. Now, for anybody who doesn't like that word, I do want to let you know, by the way, that word is biblical, okay? It is a biblical word, so you can't, it's okay to say stupid. It is. Now, you probably don't want to, tell children they can say it all they want, but, I know we don't like children to go around, you're stupid, but it actually is a biblical word. In fact, Proverbs 12:1, it says this, whoever loves instruction loves knowledge. And by the way, how fitting is this with Jonah here? Whoever loves instruction loves knowledge, but he who hates correction is stupid. Did you know that's in the Bible? Yeah. Proverbs 12:1. And it's very true. Whoever loves instruction loves knowledge, but he who hates correction is stupid. And that's what we see here with Jonah. A ridiculous man. I mean, just the ridiculousness here. It's crazy. And how do we know that? Because so many of us we've waited so much longer to answer God when he calls us, right? We've gone longer than just days or even weeks. There have been times maybe where we've gone months or even years when God comes to us when we're kicking against his will. So how do we know how ridiculous this is? Because we've been there. Some of us may have. Or maybe you know some people who have, right? In fact, you look at Jonah's situation here, and you compare Jonah to a lot of Christians. Jonah compared to many Christians who wait and just keep kicking against God's will. Jonah compared to a lot of other Christians, he would actually look like somebody who was almost instantly responding to God compared to others. So that's how we know. I mean, it's nothing new for us. Maybe some of you. I know if I'm going to be honest, there have been times in my life where I've just waited too long, been too stubborn, And so that's how we know. But yeah, I mean, when you see that, just the stubbornness of this man, to go through all of that, all those different stages and experiences and those instances that would not get him to turn to God until finally, 3 days in the belly of the fish, and finally he calls out. The second thing here I want to point out is notice that it says that Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from where? Where'd he call out from? From the fish's belly. Okay? Now, as we're going to see in his prayer, as we get into it here in a second, notice that he calls out to God at the lowest point of his circumstance. That's where he's at. He's at the lowest point of his circumstance. That's when he calls out to the Lord. So look at his prayer. It starts out in verse 2 saying this, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction. Now, the Hebrew word for affliction, just think it's interesting here, it carries the meaning of adversity and distress or trouble. So he says, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction or because of my trouble. And then he tells us about the affliction. He says, out of the belly of Sheol I cried. Okay, you see that? Out of the belly of Sheol I cried. Now, before we go any further, it is important to understand what is Sheol. The Hebrew word for Sheol, okay, actually the Hebrew thought or the mindset is actually known as Hades as well, not to be mistaken for the lake of fire, but this is also known as hell or Hades. Now, there is a lake of fire, and then there's Sheol or Hades, and there's a difference there. Now, for every Old Testament person who died before the cross, their soul went to this place of Sheol or Hades. And Sheol, it was made up of two areas or dwellings or subsections within itself. Two areas, so you have Sheol, and then there's two sub-areas within it. A place of paradise, which is reserved for the godly, the Old Testament saints who went there. A place of paradise, it was for the godly who died in faith toward God. And this actually is mentioned by Jesus when he was talking to the thief on the cross in Luke 23. And he said, today you'll be with me in paradise. So that portion of Sheol, he was actually telling him, you'll be with me in paradise at that time. So that's the godly place. That's where those who were godly would actually go. Kind of I guess you could say a waiting room, a silly way of looking at it, but a waiting room for heaven. And that was paradise. And then there was also, the other place was a place of torment for the ungodly. And actually both of them were mentioned in Luke 16 in the story that Jesus told, the account of the rich man and Lazarus, where he actually mentions both of them in that account, where Jesus did. So the place of paradise and place of torment. And actually, in that account, Jesus actually refers to the place of paradise as Abraham's bosom, is what he talks about there. So they're both mentioned there, both places there, all in Sheol. Now, the place of Sheol, it's only a temporary place, as there both has come and will come times when both the godly and ungodly will be resurrected from Sheol. So it's only temporary. Godly and ungodly will leave that place or have left that place. And it's going to be a deliverance or resurrection from there to be delivered ultimately to the permanent locations, the permanent destinations of the lake of fire, which I did mention earlier. That's the permanent hell. That's mentioned in Revelation chapter 20. And then also for the godly, that their ultimate destination, our ultimate destination, is the new heavens and new earth. And that's in Revelation 21. So Revelation 20 is for the ungodly. That's their final destination of the lake of fire. And then new heavens, new earth for the godly in Revelation 20 and 21. Now, as for the hell and torment portion of Sheol, the Jews understand Sheol to be a place from which there's no escape, which is true, which is of course, that is the case. But they also understand it to be a place of darkness, a place of forgetfulness as well, as in the one who goes there is forgotten forever. And that's what they believe. So a place of darkness and also a place of forgetfulness. If you go there, you are forever forgotten. And they also see it as a place where you are cut off and completely separated from and removed from the sight of God forever. So you're also just completely cut off. God cannot see you anymore. You're out of his sight forever. And so that's what they believe, the things they believe about Sheol here. And notice he used the phrase, the belly of Sheol, right? And so the Hebrew word here for belly in this verse is different from the belly used in verse 1. In verse 1, he's talking about, it actually means, the Hebrew word means the digestive part of an animal, in that case, the fish. But here, the Hebrew word, it actually carries the meaning of womb, of a womb. And it speaks of the innermost part. So he'd be referring to the innermost part of Sheol. Actually, the NASB, I don't know if any of you have that, but the NASB translates it as the depth. The depth. So it's talking about the depth or the innermost part of Sheol is what he's referring to with that phrase. But the important thing to look at here is when it comes to the Jews, in their culture, okay, during the Old Testament and the time of Jonah, they actually believe, get this is what's important, it's going to tie into the prayer here. They actually believe that the sea is where Sheol was. The depths or the bottom of the sea was actually Sheol. That's what they believed. The sea, the bottom of the sea, was actually Sheol there. So that's their belief. A commentary shared this regarding the Jewish mindset when it came to the sea. It says this: in the Old Testament, the sea is often described as a place of chaos and disorder. To go to the sea, and especially into its depths, is to go away from God's presence, as Israel knew his presence through the tabernacle and temple in the promised land. So again, to go to the sea and into the depths of it is to go away from God's presence. That's where they thought Sheol was. So, knowing that the Jews saw the sea as Sheol, a place of darkness, okay, of being forgotten, of being separated from the presence of God forever. Okay, keep that in mind as we continue with Jonah's prayer. Look at verse 3. It says, "For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your billows and your waves passed over me." Now notice Jonah says, "For you cast me in the deep." You see that? He acknowledged that it was God, right? He acknowledged that God was coming after him by bringing that storm, right, in chapter 1. But here, he's acknowledging in his prayer that it was God that was moving to get Jonah's attention. So he notices that. And then notice he says, "Your billows and your waves," right? Or in other words, another way to phrase that is, "Your wild, stormy waves," is what he's saying there. So by referring to them as God's storm, God's stormy waves, he's not only recognizing that God was moving, but also acknowledging that God's the maker of the sea and God's in control of the sea. And we touched on that in chapter 1. But he also acknowledging that God is in control of the sea. His hand is in it. And he did that, if you remember, like I said, to the men on the ship in chapter 1. He acknowledged that then too. But that was where Jonah's, he acknowledged who God was in front of the men, said, I worship, the existing one, is what he told them. But if you remember, at that point, when he acknowledged that, his words were opposite of his actions, weren't they? We talked about that, how at that point, he said one thing. He said, "I worship God," but his actions weren't showing it because he was running away from God. Here, though, here and now, his words do match where his heart was with God. Because we see in this prayer, we're going to continue to see, it's a surrender to God's will in the prayer. And so he is matching his words with his actions, or with his heart, the condition of his heart anyway. Notice the phrases, into the deep and also heart of the seas. Again, they're likely references to Sheol or hell here. Now, remember, we just mentioned it. I'm going to repeat it again. Remember how the Jews saw Sheol, a place of darkness and being forgotten and being separated from the presence of God forever, right? So then in verses 5 and 6, when he says, "The waters surrounded me to my soul, the deep closed around me." And then also see where he says, "I went down to the moorings," or actually the roots is what it's talking about there. "I went down to the roots of the mountains. The earth with its bars," or its gates, "the earth with its bars closed behind me forever." So he's using more phrases. You see the phrases here he's using that describe, it sounds like descriptions of Sheol, how he would think of it. Again, the mindset of the Jewish nation here, the mindset of a Jewish man here. He's using these phrases that sound like descriptions of Sheol. The aspect of darkness, and him praying, also where he prayed, "The deep closed around me," okay? And so he's using these phrases that would make, it would be descriptions of Sheol in his mind. Now, something I think, just a little fun fact here. The darkest regions of the ocean, okay, are found to be about 2,000 meters deep all the way down to the sea floor, okay? So the darkest regions of the ocean, of the sea, are from 2,000 feet deep, from there down to the bottom of the sea. Those are the darkest regions, okay? It's been described as a realm of perpetual darkness and utter blackness. I mean, you go down there and you see nothing. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. Like being in a cave, the deepest recesses of the cave, and just no lights, and you can't see that. You feeling your hand before you see it. That kind of a darkness. It actually has a name for it. The region there in the bottom of the sea. It's actually known as the midnight zone. And the sea that Jonah, the sea that Jonah was traveling on to go to Tarshish, it was the Mediterranean Sea. But more specifically, it was the Levantine Sea, which is the easternmost part of the Mediterranean. So if I'm kind of working backwards here, but if you have the Mediterranean, here's Israel, right? And the whole Mediterranean is this, but it's the eastern part, the eastern section is the Levantine Sea. It actually stretches from Israel over to near the island of Crete. That's the Levantine Sea, which is a portion of the bigger Mediterranean. And so that's where he would have been going through. Now, the deepest part of the Levantine Sea is known as Pliny Trench, is what it's called. And so it's known as Pliny Trench, and it is plenty deep, is what I've actually found out. It is plenty deep. And you wake up, you'll realize what I just said there. But anyway, I'll move on. Pliny Trench is plenty deep. So, I'm just not even going to try to pull that one out. Leave it alone. Move it on. So it is deep, though. It is known to be 4,384 meters deep. So 2,000, did I say earlier? 2,000 meters. Maybe I said feet. 2,000 meters down. Did I say feet earlier? Okay. Did I say both? Okay, it was meters. All right. So 2,000 meters deep down to the floor is the darkest part. Now, this is 4,300 meters, 4,384 meters deep is the deepest part of the Levantine Sea. Now, do we know if he was actually dropped right there? We don't, but the whole point is, if that's the deepest part, and you have other areas out there in the middle of the Levantine Sea that are near that, chances are very likely that Jonah hit that darkest part of the sea, that far deep down where he would have actually gone. And so, when he says, the deep closed around me, it certainly would have been made him feel like he was plunged into Sheol, into that place of darkness, right? You see the picture now? He's dropped into and sinks into that just total, utter darkness. Now you can see why he would think, I'm at Sheol. Wow, that's really what, you kind of get that picture of what he might have been thinking, in the water there. And then when it says he went down to the roots of the mountain, that's basically saying that he went, or he felt like he went to the bottom of the floor of the sea. So to go to the roots of the mountain, the very bottom of the sea itself, is where he felt like he was at that point. And that's why it says, by the way, that the seaweed was wrapped around his head, because seaweed is generally found where? It's found at the bottom of the ocean. At least the seaweed that's large enough to wrap around a person's head, wrap around Jonah's head here, that's found at the very bottom or the floor of the ocean. So when it says the seaweed wrapped around his head, it's likely because he was at or near that bottom where actually he would have got wrapped up and tangled up in that seaweed. And then when it says the bars, or the gates is another word, the gates of the earth closed behind him forever, it was as if he was feeling cut off, right? Here's, again, that picture or that thought of Sheol, like he was being cut off and separated from God, like he was imprisoned in Sheol at that time, And then notice in verse 4, look at verse 4, where he says, I have been cast out of your sight. Again, also, we see an indication here that he felt separated from the presence of God, been cast out of your sight. So that separation from God. And so then Jonah now describes here the experience that he went through, feeling that separation, that darkness, that, I'm forgotten by God forever. Now he's going through all this. He's explaining all this. And again, who did this to him? Who has done this? God's responsible for this, right? God is doing this to him. So God did this. Now think about this. We should notice here that it took Jonah sinking to the very depths to the lowest and the darkest point to finally realize his need to turn back to God. You see that? So he is sinking to the very depths, the lowest point he can go, the darkest point in his life, to finally come to that point to realize, I've got to turn back to God. I need to surrender to his will. And then also you see how in the sea, Jonah quickly came to the point of realizing just how incredibly helpless and weak he is, right? I mean, try to put yourself in his situation. You're sinking in this raging sea and just the depths of it. You're talking thousands of meters deep, right? And he quickly came to the point of realizing just how helpless, how weak he is in comparison to, not God, but in comparison to a created thing, the ocean. Just a created thing that God created, okay? Just comparing himself to that, how helpless and weak is he? And then to know that the created thing, the sea, was enormously and much stronger than Jonah, but God's in control of it. Okay, so God is in control of that enormously powerful thing. And God is enormously much stronger than the sea. Okay? So this is what he's realizing here. This is what, you think about it. Jonah is nothing compared to just the sea. And the sea is nothing compared to God. Okay, so how is Jonah compared to the Lord Almighty? So he's coming to that point of realizing that just the enormity of God compared to himself. And that's what it takes for us as well. When we're going against God's will, right, for repentance to take place, we've got to humble ourselves to the lowest point and come to the end of ourselves to realize that God is God and we're not. And that's where Jonah had to get to. That's the point he had to get to. Get to that lowest point where he finally realizes God is amazing. God is all powerful. God is God. I am nothing compared to him. And that's where God took him. That's where God took him. God was in control of all that. And God knew it's going to take that to get this stubborn man, to get this rebellious man to come back to me. So, and we do see Jonah surrender. Again, I mentioned it already, right? That we're going to see in this prayer that Jonah surrenders. He does surrender to the Lord. He surrenders in his prayer. Look at the second half of verse 4. He says this. It says, "Yet I will look again toward your holy temple." Now that is the opposite of being cast from God's presence, right? Yes. Where he says, I will look to your presence. So the idea, again, of Sheol is being cast away from God forever. But now he's saying, I'm going to look to you. I'm going to look to your presence. And then look at verse 2, where he says a couple different things. He says, he answered me. And then he also said, and you heard my voice. Right? So he says there, in the lowest point and darkest point, basically where he's at the doorstep of Sheol, he's at the doorstep of hell, is what he's thinking, is how he's feeling here in his mind. About to step into the point of no return, God heard his cry and answered him. You know? It's pretty cool. And then look at the rest of verse 6. It says, "Yet you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer went up to you into your holy temple. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord." So Jonah says, I remembered the Lord, right? He was reminded of the Lord, of who God is. He was reminded of who God is, a merciful and gracious God. That's why he left to begin with. We talked about that last week as we looked ahead to chapter 4. And when we get to that, we'll talk a lot about that. But he already knew, but he was reminded of who God is, merciful and gracious God. Now, the only thing better than reminding oneself of the goodness of God is not getting to the point of forgetting and needing to have to be reminded. You get that? The only thing better than reminding oneself of the goodness of God, the only thing better than that, is not ever getting to the point where you have to be reminded. You come to the point where you forget and have to be reminded of that. Now, continual remembering, should be what we want to do, for sure. If you want to look at that, and we should look at that in a good way, continually being reminded, yes, for sure. That's something we definitely want to live with, a continual reminder of who God is, how great he is. But not remembering because of a period of time where we lose sight of God and his goodness, that's where we don't want to be. Okay, that's what we want to avoid, is having that period of time where we forget that and then we have to be reminded. That's what we want to stay away from. And notice in verse 8, God calls attention to Jonah calls attention to God's mercy. The New Living Translation, it says it this way, which actually it's a good way to better understand what he's saying here. The New Living Translation says, those who worship false gods turn their backs on all of God's mercies. That's what it's saying there. If you worship false gods, you're turning your back on all of God's mercy. And why is that? Why is that? Because worshiping false gods, the idolatry, is just a result of living in pride. If you think about it, people who set up false gods and idols in their life, the gods they set up, the idols they form, are just things. Of course, they're things, but they're things that are made for that person's pleasure, or they make them in their own image, or whatever the case. But it's all pride. It's all a result of pride in that person's heart that causes them to set up whatever idols or gods they worship, the false gods. And so it's a result of pride, living in pride, which makes them think that they're calling the shots in their life, and God's not. And so that's the problem there. And again, it requires what? It requires humbling to lowliness and surrender, coming to that point of lowliness and surrender in the person's heart to realize God's goodness and his mercy and grace. And it just takes that that humility to actually get to that point. It's the humility that will do away with the pride, coming to the point of surrendering to God. And then God's goodness, God's mercy, his love, his grace, and then to accept that and to walk in it. As a result of turning to God, surrendering to him, Jonah says it results in what? What's the result? An offering to God. That's going to be the result of no more rebellion, no more rebellion and running from God, walking in pride, walking in flesh, but then that surrender because of humility, coming to the point of humility, humbling oneself to the point of surrender to God's will, to his desire, to his pleasure. Getting to that point, the result of that will then be, and again, what was Jonah's response? Jonah's response was just, wow, how great is God? How powerful is God? If I am nothing compared to God's creation, how much more nothing am I compared to God? Just getting to that point of seeing God for who he really is, how powerful and mighty he is, how loving he is, how gracious and merciful he is. And he's going to see here, actually, the way he finishes it, we'll touch on it here in a minute, just how God saves as well, the mercy and grace of God. But it results in what? It results in offering to the Lord. Offering to God. And what does he say It's a sacrifice of what? Sacrifice of what? It's a sacrifice of money, of time, of giving the best I've got. No, it's a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Sacrifice of thanksgiving. I don't have time to go to all the scriptures in the New Testament, but I have a few if you're taking them down or you just got a wonderful memory and you want to memorize these. Colossians 1:12, Colossians 3:17, Ephesians 5:20, and 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Those are just a few of the scriptures that speak of giving thanks to God, thanksgiving to God, being thankful to the Lord. Colossians 1:12, Colossians 3:17, Ephesians 5:20, 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Now there is another one I do want to read. I want to share it because it fits in perfectly with Jonah's situation here and where Jonah's heart is at this point. Hebrews 13:15. Hebrews 13:15, where the verses before it actually speak of Jesus having given his own blood as the sacrifice for our sins. It comes into verse 15 saying this: therefore, by him, by Christ, let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. The sacrifice of praise to God, giving thanks to his name. Love that. And why did Jonah offer thanksgiving? Why did he offer thanksgiving? And why should we offer a thanksgiving, a life of thanksgiving to God? Well, how did he finish his prayer? What are the last 5 words of his prayer? Because of how he ends it. Salvation is of the Lord. Salvation is of the Lord. Now, something I want to share, because in verse 6, Jonah says this. He says, yet you have brought my life from the pit. O Lord my God, you have brought my life from the pit. Psalm 40. If you want to turn there real quick, you can. I want to read just the first few verses of Psalm 40, because when he says that, it makes me think of Psalm 40. That is a beautiful psalm. Psalm 40, which can relate to what Jonah's feeling here, what he's praying, what he's gone through. Now with Jonah, it's self-inflicted, of course, but just what a beautiful psalm here that really fits in with Jonah. I know it would fit in if you're a believer tonight. If you're here and you're a believer, actually, are you here? You ever notice when people say that? If you're here and you're a believer. If you are a believer, then this fits in. I mean, what a beautiful psalm for all of us. Psalm 40, verse 1, it starts like this. It says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. He also brought me up out of a horrible pit. Jonah used that same word, pit. You brought me from the pit. And that's what made me think of Psalm 40. He also brought me up out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock. Set my feet upon a rock and established my steps. He has put a new song in my mouth. That's the result. This would be the result of it. He has put a new song in my mouth. Praise to our God. Many will see it and fear and will trust in the Lord as a result, right? Then you go on, for time's sake, we're not going to read the rest, but especially the next few verses, it's all about the result of that. And I love that. Just what would be the result of God taking me, taking you from a pit and from the miry clay, from that deep, dark pit that we were in, and taking us and lifting us out of that and setting us on the rock, the Lord Jesus Christ, right? I love that. I love that. And that just made me think of Jonah, and you know he's got to be feeling that here. He's got to be feeling that in what he's going through here. And after what he's gone through, self-inflicted, Absolutely. Running from God. And it took God to chase him down. Remember the hound of heaven, right? God chasing him, coming to him, and getting to him to the point where he would surrender. And then just the feeling of knowing, I'm knocking on the door of hell as a result of what I've done. And yet the Lord still desires to pull me out of the pit and set my feet on a rock. And so, how does he finish it? Salvation is of the Lord. So then we read what happened after Jonah ended his prayer, right? Verse 10. And that'll end this chapter here. So the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. So the Lord, at that moment, speaks to the fish, vomits him out. Go ahead and throw him up. A preacher was doing his children's church moment, okay, in the church that he was pastoring. It's the moment, and if you've been in the churches where they call up the kids to the front of the sanctuary, you know, with the adults and all that there, they call the kids to the front, they have them sitting out front, and a little time where he does a brief little, like a story or shares an account from the Bible to the kids, you know, like a little children's church miniature devotion time. And he shared with them this account of Jonah and the great fish. And he got to the verse where it says what we just read. The Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. And when he finished, he started asking questions to the kids just to kind of get some input from them. He asked them, what does the fish vomiting Jonah out on dry land indicate to us today? One of the kids responded and said, well, it tells me even a fish can't stomach a bad preacher. So that's interesting. Even a fish can't stomach a bad preacher. So, thought I'd share that. That was kind of funny. A couple things to point out as we end here, though. Just a couple more things. I mentioned it before at the beginning of the chapter, right? How Jonah waited 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish before finally praying to God. And again, this verse here is the indication of that, because as soon as he was finished praying, he was vomited out of the fish. But what is so wonderful to point out about this, okay, is notice this also. As soon as Jonah cried out to God with a heart of surrender, okay, with a heart of surrender to the Lord's will, the Lord answered by having the fish bring him up out of the pit. Immediately. So it's not like the Lord waited either. Okay? As soon as he responded with a heart of repentance, the Lord immediately responded to him. And that should, I know I touched on this last week as well, and I'll mention it again. It should give us that sense that God is eagerly and enthusiastically waiting to call out to us. He's waiting to call out to us, and then, or waiting for us to call out, and then he's instantly ready to reconnect with us. You know that? So he's eagerly waiting, excitedly waiting for us to call out, and then for him to instantly reconnect with us, and we can have that fellowship with him. That's him. That's his heart. That's his desire. He's just waiting excitedly for you and for me. And I said this, I'll say it again. He is so much more excited about being with you than you'll ever be about being with him. Ever. God so much more wants you than you'll ever want him. That's the God we serve. That's our Father in heaven. How amazing is that? Wonderful, the God we have. He's excited. Think about this. He is excited. God loves you, but did you know he also likes you? Right? God loves you, but he also likes you. And he's excited about you. You ever thought about that? God is excited about you. He's excited about me. That's the God we serve. Now, the second thing to point out, okay? We have a little time. The second thing to point out here with this account of Jonah being in the swallowed by the fish, being in the belly of the whale for 3 days, 3 nights, being vomited out onto land, okay? This account, if you've read your New Testament, and maybe you've run across this, I hope you have, this account was used by Jesus himself as a picture or type or a shadow of his own death, burial, and resurrection. You can find it in a couple of places in the New Testament, in the Gospels, but in Matthew 12:40 specifically, it's there. So he used this very account of Jonah, again, as a shadow or a type or a symbol of his own death, burial, and resurrection. And especially how cool is this? How great is this when we see that picture again that I shared last week? And we talked about this. If you weren't here, I'll basically quickly share it with you. But if the men on the ship came to faith in God as a result of what Jonah did, and many believe that they did based on their response, that the men of the ship who were ungodly, they came to a faith in God as a result of what they saw with just the Jonah being thrown over, and then immediately the calmness. That was nothing but the existing God alone. If they came to a faith in God as a result of that, after Jonah was thrown in the sea, then it took the sacrifice of another to bring the men to the saving faith in the Lord. And then we take it a step further, okay? So this is how this ties in with the picture of Christ, or this is a picture that ties in with Christ. So it took the sacrifice of another to bring others to a saving knowledge of the Lord. And then the one who was sacrificed went to the deepest and darkest point, as God the Son also did so. God the Son went to the deepest and darkest point in being separated from the Father on the cross. The darkest point he had ever experienced, he went to for us. And then the sacrificed one was 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, as Jesus put it in Matthew 12. That's his actual phrase of it, okay? And then after those 3 days, as Jonah was brought up from the deep, so Jesus was also resurrected. And how about this one? I love this one. And both Jonah and Jesus were brought up from the heart of the earth by who? By God. So you just see those parallels. You can absolutely see why Jesus used that very picture as a type or a shadow of what he was going to, because he hadn't done it. He was explaining it at that point. But what he was going to go through for us is that beautiful picture there. The parallels are wonderful. But another thing you see here as we end the chapter, okay, think about the time that Jonah spent from chapter 1, verse 3, okay, when he decided to flee from the Lord, all the way to this point at the end of chapter 2. Okay, all that time, at least several days, but more likely weeks or maybe even months, okay? All that time Jonah spent running in the opposite direction from God instead of moving forward and walking with God, okay? Instead of progressing in his life as a man of God. Instead, he was walking away from God. So even when he was away from God, going in the opposite direction, he wasn't in neutral. It's not like he's just hit neutral, okay? In our walk with the Lord, there's never neutral. If we're not going forward with God, we're moving back. And that's exactly what it was with Jonah. He actually was going back. And actually, you could use the term backsliding, because we've heard of that term, right? Sliding back. Well, that's actually what he was doing. He's sliding back in the opposite direction. And so that's Jonah here. When he wasn't walking with God and moving forward, he was walking away from him, moving backward, right? All that time, when he could have been moving forward with the Lord, he spent the time going reverse, to the point where God had to chase him down, get him to stop going in the opposite direction, right? And then once he got him stopped, then he recognized God again, surrendered himself again, and finally he turned back around to move forward. Okay? So he's moving in the wrong direction. God has to stop him, get him to the point of stopping, surrendering, turning back around to get to moving in the right direction again. Now, here's my question. When he finally turns around and gets to the point where he needs to be, in repentance, back surrendering to God's will, where is Jonah's new starting point? Where is his new starting point for moving forward? That new starting point for Jonah is at the point where he turned from God to begin with. Right at the same point. The same point is chapter 1, verse 3. So for those days, well, more likely weeks, or maybe even months, right? For all that time he spent running away from God, right? When he turns around in the right direction, he's no further along than when he left God to begin with. No further along at all. All that time that could have otherwise been spent growing and strengthening himself in the Lord, right? Being used by God in mighty ways. Enjoying the blessings of God in fellowship with him. All that time could have been spent with that. Instead, it was time wasted. Time that was wasted. Wasted in terms of spending it on his own selfish, fleshly desires, his sinful desires. He wasted that time on his own desires, which is always a result of what? Pain, suffering, and misery, destruction. Could even be death if you keep going that far, that long, right? That's the result of all that. But he missed out on the blessings of walking with God during that whole time, however long it was. He missed out on that time he could otherwise be spending growing with God. It's like this, a picture I can actually relate to. So it's like you're going down the interstate, okay? And you're driving along. I can relate to this, unfortunately. I can a few times. You're driving along the interstate, you're looking for an exit, and you're just going along, and for some reason you miss that exit, okay? You got to get off on a certain exit and then go in another direction to on the journey you're going. You miss that exit. So then you miss the exit and you have to go maybe, 5, 10, maybe 20, 30 minutes down the road to get to the next exit, to turn around and then come back to where you're supposed to be to begin with so that you can then make that turn and keep on your way, right? Well, I've done this too many times to want to admit, but I'm admitting it anyway. But, you keep going down, so you miss the exit, then you get down maybe 15, 20 minutes down the road to get to the next exit. You have to turn around. Am I the only one that's done this? Okay. Just making sure if I am, oh well, I'll use myself. But I know you guys have had to have done it. But you keep going down, now you turn around. You come back. The whole time I've done it, I'm just huffing. I'm just frustrated. I'm just like, really, why? Why did I do this? And of course, for me, you can ask Melissa, it's usually I'm talking. I have come to realize I cannot talk and drive at the same time anymore. I used to, but I don't know, maybe it's an age thing, maybe. But, and I just get frustrated. And I'm like, there's the exit, and I can't turn around, and I've got to go, oh, great, next exit, 10 miles down. So I get down to the next exit. I get off. I turn around, come back. So I'm 20, 30 minutes out of my way to get back where I was to begin with, or to start with, to actually keep going down the journey, right? So finally, once I get back there, it's great that I'm back where I need to go, and I'm back on my route. But then I started thinking, it's like that time I could have spent. That time it was wasted because I wasn't doing what I needed to do to get where I wanted to go in the first place. That's 20 or 30 minutes out of my way to where I could be 20 or 30 minutes further down the road and closer to my destination. It just gets frustrating. And that's what it's like when we spend that time in rebellion against God. We spend that time away from God, out of his will. When we get back to the point of surrendering ourselves to him again, it's like we're back at the exit we needed to be, and now we can continue on our way. But for all that time, it's like, I could have been that much further ahead. That's what we miss out on. Now, when I say it's wasted time, okay, I have heard that, I've heard it said, no time is wasted time in our lives. And in a sense, I understand that when there's sin in our life, or there are those periods in our life where we do fail. In this case, we're talking about Jonah with sin, right? In those times that we have, yes, those are times we can learn from, we can grow from, we can actually, by that experience, realize, okay, I don't want to do that again. I want to avoid that. So yes, in that sense, there's no wasted time. But even in those situations, okay, even in those times, what I found is those are times that could have, or rather should have been avoided to begin with, right? So that's what we're dealing with. So even in those times, yes, we can learn from them, but they should have been avoided and not even gone there to begin with. So it could have been so much better off to not even go there. And so that's the point. And so in terms of the fact that it's time spent in sin and not with God, growing with him, being used by the Lord in those times, we're in rebellion to him, that's time that's wasted. That we could otherwise be out there sharing the gospel, serving one another, doing what we can for each other, growing in the Lord, and glorifying him. Instead of spending a time of our life, however long that time frame is, of just glorifying ourselves. So, anyway, we see Jonah's back where he started from, right? In chapter 1, verse 3. And the reason I say that is because of what we're going to see, or actually what we see in chapter 3, verse 1, which we're actually going to get to next week. But let's read it real quick, and I just want to show you why I say that. Why do you say he's back where he started? Because look at verse 1 of chapter 3. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you. That's the same exact thing he told him in chapter 1, verse 3. That's why I say he's right back where he started. Time wasted. He could have already been that much further than Nineveh, if not already there. Already working or doing for the Lord and giving God glory, right? But he had to miss the exit. Had to go and do a U-turn and come back and all that. But yeah, so the time from chapter 1, verse 3 to chapter 3, verse 1, all that time, wouldn't it be so wonderful if that could have just been not in the Bible? But it's there so that we can learn from it. Most definitely. But anyway, that's where we'll pick up next time when we get together. So yeah, we see here, what a beautiful thing, though, to end with this is Jonah's prayer. He did get to the point, and that's the important thing. Like I said earlier, the best thing is to never get to the point to have to be reminded of the goodness of God. But the next best thing is to come to that point, to come back to that point of surrender and remember God.